won't be attending our meal tonight, so we have to take her to now because she's going to deliver.
If she's missing dinner, are you going to give her a sandwich or something?
South Africa, they have doggy bags.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure really to cooperate with all of you, and especially with you. So I think that will happen again and again and again, and the cycle will be.
She's behind all the fancy hotels, you know, which you cannot really operate. All the arrangements, streaming. I don't know if you know, but we're being streamed. Everything is online.
I watched the sessions this morning. It's working great.
That's great. Yeah, you will receive a stick, all of you will receive a stick with photos, which will be really beautiful because I've seen some. And the video from the conference will be updated.
And not to mention that she's doing several events at one time, bilocating or multilocating, etc. So
Photoshopping these photos.
Thank you again.
Before you leave, I would like also to say something dedicated to Kasia from us participants. I hope you will agree. She was the name of this conference for all of us. So thanks for the effort you made. And please be extremely careful with that beauty of yours. It can be more dangerous than nationalism.
yes, that's the real threat.
Yeah?
Is it? There you go. Okay. So, we had a nice moment. Now things are going to get ugly and messy. Because I'm chairing this session. Second one I'm chairing. I don't know why. Anyway.
You're the chosen one, that's why.
Yeah. I'll be very strict with the time because I don't want you to, steal anything from my own time because I'm following. Right? So expect me to be tough. Anyway, so okay, we have just the two papers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Lucia, how should you pronounce it?
It's Lucia.
Lucia.
Yeah.
Oh, because you have the L with the.
That's.
Okay. Lucia, please go ahead.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you everybody for being here. This has been really inspiring time for me. And I must say that if some of you have read my pre-paper, it's going to be different what I will present because I would focus only on one aspect of what I presented, and you can read it up what I wrote about in the paper. I would like to focus on the biggest museum in Poland, which was opened in March 2017. It's located in Gdańsk, and it's a museum of World War II, as you can see. And I think that in the context of defining nation, but first of all, in context of how the symbolic capital of a country is transferred into the political capital and the political legacy, this is a really significant example of the kind of messages that are being created, but also in terms of two visions of nation and two visions of the attitude towards the past that I'm going to present now. What you can see here is the logo of the museum and also the photograph which summarizes one of the points. It says, museum is for citizens, not for the politicians. And this was one of the slogans used during the manifestations that took place after the museum was opened. I will briefly tell you about some facts and figures about it. This is the museum. This is supposed to be the national monument. That's what it looks like. And the very short story of the museum is that it was designed and the establishing documents were done by Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister, nearly 10 years ago. And he himself comes from Gdańsk, so he was thought to be the real, co-author of the museum. And it took nearly 10 years for the museum to be finished. In the meantime, the government in Poland changed. So now, 2 weeks after the museum was opened in March, the idea was that the government tried to do something to take total control over the museum. And what happened was that it could not close the museum, so it created another museum in Gdańsk and made the decision to combine two museums into a new institution. And this is how they could have a new director and start building a new story around the museum. So everything happened in the year 2017. And my argument is that the new museology is being created, and it's a kind of national museology around the Museum of the Second World War. And we need to remember that the Second World War is the kind of most important, probably, symbolic capital for the Polish identity. So how it's consumed and how it's developed is really crucial for Polish identity. Just a very quick note about new museology. In the very famous riots in Paris that led to the collapse of General de Gaulle's government, there was a very interesting movement that started with the need of the citizens to share the heritage. So one of the ideas was that the state had no longer single authority to control the interpretation over the past, and that citizens could share the interpretation over heritage. This movement started to be called New Museology, and it can be also called democratic, inclusive museology. Today it is considered to be a part of Europeanization process of heritage. And this is where a number of European ideas actually get conceptualized, and we may have a look at democratization as the most important of Europeanization of heritage. In this respect, we don't actually look at museums as at sort of ivory towers that only sacralize the past and safeguard the past, but they are in fact considered to be some kind of identity institutions. So they are not static safeguarding places, but rather places of dynamic reinterpretation of the past. It is also possible to apply a concept of civilizing tool to the museum. So museums would be the institutions that actually introduce the ways of institutionalizing and civilizing, bringing Europe to the discourse of public memory. And the central idea for the Europeanization of heritage would be the concept of a person. The photograph that you can see here is the founding father of the museum, and I'm going to Donald Tusk. And now I would just very briefly, I would like to present a short framework consisting of 7 elements that allow us to analyze museums. One of the problems when you analyze museums is that there is so much to look at. Yeah? There's so many narratives, there is the part of the experience, there's visitors' experience, there is the expectations of clients, there's so much, and it's very difficult to focus only, honestly, on the narratives. And then why would we focus only on the narratives? So, what we're trying to do in that approach, we're trying to focus on several European qualities and try to defend the concept of Europeanization. But before I go on, I would like to present you two main critiques of the current right-wing government towards the exhibition. And those two main critiques basically show the axis of the whole conflict. One is that the history that is told in the museum does not represent Polish state viewpoint. Yeah? Which means, in open way, that the museum is thought to be a tool for making historical policy. Because, in the word of Minister of Culture Professor Gliński and Jarosław Kaczyński, museums are there to represent Polish viewpoint, not to reproduce the past or share the past or give the past to be interpreted, whatever. They are to represent the Polish viewpoint. Yeah? And the critics is that when Polish history gets contextualized and gets shown as one of the stories, it's for the bad of the Polish business. Polish business is actually, Polish viewpoint is something that needs to be stated. The second thing that Law and Justice government doesn't like in the newly opened exhibition is that the presence of military symbol is too small, and that there should be more military and more church in the exhibition instead of civilian people who are overrepresented according to Law and Justice. Yeah? So, on one hand, you have very strict vision of history, which is some kind of monolithic belonging to nation as an entirety. On the other hand, you have the inclusive vision of history which is done, which is operated, authored by the people. And this is basically also not only the vision of the past, but also the vision of thinking about the society and of the attitude towards the past. So, what might we look at if you would like to see the kind of basic questions that we ask when we research the exhibition? How much time do I have? Excuse me.
I'll tell you. Sorry.
Got lost.
Just a minute. 5 minutes and 30 seconds.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So the first figure is progress. In neoliberal discourse, history makes sense because it leads towards something. Okay, it has sense. Our actions have sense because they are directed to the future. Okay, and this is basically the kind of vision of history presented originally by the World War II Museum. There is a kind of flow of history, written as history, but war disrupted it, and then it came back to the normal linearity. This is the story told by the authors of the museum originally. Whereas what I find the main model of time presented by Law and Justice now is actually the mythological time. There is no linearity. There is the rule of prefiguration. What it means? It means that some events are presented in order to precede some other events. For example, some of the war events are presented as those who anticipated the plane catastrophe of Smolensk. I mean, it's funny to some extent, but the point is that what I find fascinating is that the linearity of times gets denied in the new version. Okay? The second quality is that there's always a need to ask a question, what are the museum used for, okay? And the original version of the museum is that museums are public spaces and they are used to strengthen citizenship. They are the places where people actually have to exercise their citizenship and discuss it, problematize it, okay? As I said, the new version of the museum would be to be a tool of representing Poland in the context of the world and to present Poland's only viewpoint. The third issue that we would look at in the analysis is dignity. So, for example, the question is, who are the heroes? Yeah? Would we name every sort of so-called average people? Would we allow them to have their own names? Yeah? Or would we rather talk about big institutions, just like the new version of the changing scenario for the new exhibition is doing? Yeah? We would rather talk about institutions such as church, nation, state, not about the individual people. Finally, later, the next one is the issue of diversity. The question is, how many different heritages can we actually include in the discourse of the war, in this case? Okay? Would you focus on the official discourse of the politics, of the history, of the military, or would you rather include all the minority narratives, not necessarily representing the good Polish viewpoint, the good Polish business, yeah? Would you include private heritages? Would you include all the minority stories, all the private heritages, or not? Obviously, the more monolithic history is presented, the easier to control it. The next one is inclusion. Is also the question, who gets included in the process of interpretation of the past? Okay? Can we include visitors? Can we ask them to have their own way, to have their own sentence, to have their own saying, or not? But there's also the question of including private heritages, such as you can see. This is something, 2 minutes, okay. There are two more issues, narrativity. So how the storytelling is done. Is it one-way storytelling, or would it be plurivocal? And finally, we ask a question about governance, so about democratic governance, what kind of word is reflected in the exhibition, and what kind of control over the final message of the exhibition is given. So, trying to conclude, there are two visions of state and the past that collide in the museum, with nation as a central concept. Of course, I would support what has been said during that seminar already. So, and obviously those are very simplified, but you can very easily find them in the discourse and in the public debates about the museum. On one hand, you've got the monolithic nation that is victimized and that had to suffer in order to work for its future capital, to be Poland, and it's monolithic. On the other hand, you've got diverse nation of various individuals and people. On one hand, you've got nation as a community of people and groups. On the other hand, you've got nation as a community of institutions, such as church. The late critique for the museum was that the church's role was not highlighted enough, although the individual priests were present there. And finally, as compared to what you told us yesterday, Deborah, there is an opposition between the nation as community of blood and ancestors, to whom we should give respect, and the state, the nation, as a kind of civil state. Yeah, if you take the first letters of those elements for the analysis, what comes up as an acronym is a pudding, really. So that's why, I mean, I like it because it's very easy to memorize. So you could really exercise it as a European pudding kind of thing. And it is very powerful if you operationalize it when you are in the museum for the fieldwork. Final conclusions. What I'm trying to present is a kind of concept of national museology, which would be seen as a way of transferring symbolic capital, identity capital, into the political capital. We obviously know that any power needs the past to be legalized, But the museums, and this museum, is actually the case where this is happening, yeah? Where the symbolic identity capital is in straight transmission for the legalizing of the current government. The second thing, and we don't have time for that, is a matter of democratization, what it means in Europe, to what extent it's European, to what extent it's global, but anyway, inclusive heritage and dynamic heritage can be seen as a kind of, as a phase of Europeanization process. And finally, what is my favorite, but also most dangerous point, is that the figure of truth and figure of representation of the past is actually subsidized now, being subsidized with very strict mythological structures, which are not used for any reproduction of the past, but in fact for the storytelling, which has a very obvious political sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Good, Agnieszka now.
Okay, so I think very much in line with what Lucia was saying, I will be looking at a reportage or a work of non-fiction by Marcin Kącki, a fairly well-known young reporter, investigative reporter, who has uncovered different sorts of scandals or sort of hidden links between different power holders. He was nominated to the Nike Literary Award for this book, which was published in 2015. And the title is quite significant. It's called Białystok, Biała Siła, Czarna Pamięć, which means white power, black memory. Białystok, the name Biały is white. It is connected with the name of a river nearby. However, the white power and black memory already suggests that we will be talking about sort of intertwining memories of the past and rather gruesome present of the growing nationalist, radical nationalist movement. So Białystok is a city in the Podlaskie region. I mean, this is just some very general information. So what is important is that it was one of the places where the Jewish minority was actually almost a majority in the city. Now, the national or ethnic identity claimed by the inhabitants in the 2011 census is around 94% Polish, hardly other, and then the religious denomination is over 80% Roman Catholic. However, in 1936, 43% of the inhabitants were Jewish. So there is a huge reshifting of the sort of structure of the city. What is also significant is that the Jewish cultural life in Białystok was very vibrant. There were lots of cinemas, theaters, institutions, and the pre-war urban elite was in a large part composed of Jews. So what I wanted to show based on the analysis of this reportage is how there is an absence of this Jewish past, which is somewhat deliberate, and a sort of filling of the gap by a new sort of ideology of the nationalist groups, as well as new interpretations of the past by the current government. So the different forms of the Jewish absences, for instance, are a sort of forgetting of the Jewish past. There is a concept of folder-like multiculturalism, which Podlasie promotes itself with, that shows a multicultural past, but in a very superficial and somewhat embellished way, in which there is a mention of the minorities, but not really representing the fact that it was actually a fairly, Jewish city, if you think about it. So a sociologist, whose research is also mentioned in the book, who conducted a survey with the current inhabitants of Białystok, finds that only 7% of the Białystok residents, when asked about the World War II, actually mentioned the Holocaust. Only more than 5% find that helping Jews during the war is something to be proud of. Jews are considered to be a sort of long-lost minority, deserving kind of a side note in the history of the town. There is an instance in which the reporter also comments on how the city on its official website portrays the history of the city, in which exactly the Jewish minority is just presented somewhere as, well, there were some Jews and there were some cultural organizations, fine, but definitely not as a sort of central current in the culture of the city. So that creates a sort of a problematic identity and problematic understanding of a history, which Konski calls a history without the menorah and the mezuzah, and sort of a refusal to acknowledge its Jewish past by the current inhabitants. And of course, I'm giving here different examples, focusing on sort of this negative aspect, the difficult moments of the past, while Konski also shows the activists or the local cultural actors, let's say, who try to revive that past. So, probably the most kind of metaphoric, like the best metaphor of this forgetting is the case of the old Jewish cemetery called Rabbinical Cemetery, which was destroyed during the liquidation of the Białystok ghetto. And in communist times, soon after the war, it was basically destroyed in rubble. And it was, there was a park constructed on the place of the cemetery. So Konski finds his way to the city architect, who is now in his 90s, who comments on this moment. So to quote, he says, "It was 1954, only rubble, some goats and drunkards were shitting on these matzevas, nobody would guard it. I felt sorry for the cemetery, I'm telling you honestly, and nobody thought of unearthing or moving it. So I came up with the idea to bury it, simply as it is." And then after a moment, he admits, "We all felt it should have been done differently." Now the park still exists. There is a monument there that has been erected in 1975, which says, "Tribute to the heroes of the Białostockie lands fallen in the struggle for a people's Poland." So you can imagine a very sort of communist message. In 2007, interestingly, in a sort of illegal procedure, some local patriots have added a Bóg honor ojczyzna, God honor or homeland inscription, which after some legal battles have actually been kept. So if you look at this particular place or site that has been a burial site for centuries, that contains the remains of the Jews buried there before the war, and also the ones that perished during the war, among them the Jews that were burnt alive in the Białystok synagogue. You see also that there are several layers that sort of come above this initial cemetery. There is a layer of the socialists' war narrative, and then a layer of a sort of Catholic nationalist interpretation of history. These are the pictures, actually, of the park. Now and when it was still a cemetery. And a similar sort of omission or sort of forgetting in terms of a monument, in terms of marking the space, is the monument to the children that were thrown out of the trains that were going to Treblinka death camp. So it was a sort of last desperate moment to actually save the children by hoping that if they are thrown out of the train, somebody will find them and take care of them. Unfortunately, this town of Łapy, which is near Białystok, was where the train was slowing down, and the German soldiers figured that this is happening, and most of the children did not survive. So in 1968, a monument was erected, which strangely was sponsored by the Scouts Association, and it says, "From Scouts to the heroic Polish children." Nobody really knows that it is connected with the history of the Holocaust. How this monument entered the local politics is that when a proposal of a new monument that was to be erected by a Jewish family to the people who saved them, their ancestors during the Holocaust, the right-wing local council, as Konski explains, did not agree, arguing that a monument for one Jewish family is too much, and reminded that there already is a monument devoted to the children who died tragically. Unfortunately, nobody mentions that they were Jewish children. Perhaps the most kind of shocking element is the case of Jedwabna, the case where of the town fairly close to Białystok, where the local inhabitants, Jewish inhabitants, were murdered by their Polish neighbors in put into a barn and burned. You may have heard about it. So Konski goes to the town and interviews the current inhabitants, who don't really want to acknowledge the responsibility of the previous inhabitants, sometimes their parents or grandparents, for what happened. The kebab shop owner says, it was the war, different things happened during the war, and then he adds, anyway, he doesn't like history, he always preferred scientific subjects. A young woman says, I don't know what to think about it. You read one thing on the internet and you hear another. The old people know better. We live in the present. So, and again, this kind of complete removal of the past from the current understanding of the events. And what these absences also say is that there is a space that can be sort of used in which a completely different presence can be affirmed. So Białystok became well known for the presence of the radical right groups, which even kind of appropriated this the white power symbols. So they even say white power in the white city. So welcome to the capital of the white power. They have their anti-Semitic views, but also they have different targets which they address, the LGBT community, different types of foreigners, Lithuanians who are always there in this region, but also the newcomers, Chechen family, a mixed family, and so on. They have such lovely slogans as I will not apologize for Jedwabne, all Poland only white, Poland only for whites, nationalism is our weapon. They mark their territory by, of course, painting all these graffiti and slogans. What is perhaps a link to what Louis was telling us before is that you can see that they are inspired by different sort of transnational movements, xenophobic movements. So there was even a graffiti that was in English, inspired by an American neo-Nazi. There was also a group of teenage fascists, which were actually, investigated, who covered the city with all sorts of Nazi and anti-Semitic symbols. These young boys, who were between 13 and 18 years old, openly sort of admitted to being fascist, to hating Jews. They had some drawings of swastikas in their school notebooks. Of course, nobody noticed, the parents didn't realize, and so on and so on. But what is interesting here is that even though they display this kind of very typical neo-Nazi views, they also have a certain conviction that the Jews are ruling the world, so this kind of world conspiracy. So one of the boys says that he dislikes Jews for history, for blaming Poles for the Holocaust, for their high notion of themselves, for being in the elites, for wanting to rule our country. Which by Bilevich, for instance, and other theorists of prejudices is called secondary anti-Semitism. I believe that the Jews are responsible for the anti-Semitism that targets them. So some lovely pictures of the radical movement in Białystok. The fourth one on the bottom says, "Nationalism to wolność," nationalism is freedom. I think very interesting statement for our seminar here. And finally, what the reportage reveals, it's also kind of an investigation into the links that are between these radical movements in the city and the football club, Jagiellonia Białystok, which is in turn connected with the sort of criminal underground of Białystok, but is somehow accepted or tolerated by the local institutions. There were famous issues of courts delivering very sort of lenient sentences to people who, for instance, drew swastikas and so on. What is also interesting, I think, in the light of what we were discussing earlier about patriotism and nationalism, is that the radical movements kind of appropriate the patriotism. So they say, we are the ones who are patriots, we are the ones who are proud, we don't want to be shamed for what we believe in. So because of this kind of merging of patriotism and nationalism, patriotism as supposedly more positive term becomes kind of connected with the kind of worst kind of radical or nationalist views. And finishing, another sort of way of constructing sort of new visions of the past and new heroes is this idea of celebrating the so-called cursed soldiers. There was even an exhibition, photo exhibition in front of the church here, as far as I saw. These were the soldiers that were in the Home Army, but decided to continue their fight in the communist state. So now they are considered by this government as sort of anti-communist heroes. However, a lot of them have also a very problematic past, since they were targeting Jews, they were targeting other minorities, they were, for instance, targeting Orthodox families who they were accusing of collaborating with the communists and so on. So Jarosław Kaczyński, announcing that he will open a museum of the cursed soldiers, said, "Those who were fighting for freedom were depicted earlier as bandits. Those who enslaved the Polish nation were presented as defenders of the good, sometimes as heroes." So you can see a complete sort of shifting. So the cursed soldiers are central to this new Polish right-wing politics of memory, and their appearance is simultaneous with the disappearance, wiping out of the Jewish history in Poland, especially when it comes to denying Polish responsibility in pogroms and anti-Semitic attacks, and focusing only on Polish martyrology. So the sociologist that Konski is also talking with realizes that, quote, if we do not finish our collective examination of conscience, aggression, lack of tolerance, prejudices about different groups of people, not only Jews, will intensify. And indeed, this is what seems to be happening, because the sort of anti-Semitic violence, both physical and symbolic, is also a kind of a template for other forms of prejudice, and especially in the recent time, the anti-Muslim prejudice. This has also been noticed by scholars that deal with prejudice, is how anti-Semitism provides a psychological basis for other forms of prejudice. What is interesting, I think, is, for instance, how Andrzej Leder is the last slide. How Andrzej Leder interprets this kind of forgetting of certain elements of the past. Is that after the sort of traumatic events of the Second World War and the communist times, there is a new middle class which forgets the past and focuses on the future to build a new symbolic imaginary. So the past becomes mythologized or phantasmatic, and the hegemonic middle class still lives to some extent in a dream. So this kind of strategic forgetting and remembrance of only selected events is seems to be very much central to our experience today. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, now it's time for questions and comments, please. Yes, Uroš?
So, first of all, thanks to both Lucia and Agnieszka. It was great. It was, unlike many of us, very concrete, with a real case studies. So I have one very quick and one less quick question for Agnieszka. First is Ojčina. Is Ojčina homeland or fatherland?
Ojčina is fatherland, in fact. That's
good,
yeah.
Good. And then the real question now comes. It's reminded me a lot about how the Jews and the remembrance of Jewish sufferance was treated also in some Serbian cities, smaller Serbian cities. Not necessarily Belgrade, but for example Novi Sad. So my question is, you are writing about strategic remembering and forgetting. We heard a lot about strategic forgetting, but a bit less about strategic remembering. So can you give us some more examples, especially when the very same people tend to forget and remember? And this is the first, and maybe another sub-question would be, you're speaking about strategic remembering. Analyzing the Serbian case, it's very often strategic exaggerating, even strategic inventing. Do you have these two, or you just satisfy yourselves with strategic remembering and commemorating and self-organization and martyrology, as you said? Thanks.
Should I respond now? Or should I collect
let's take at least one more. Yeah?
I have one question for you. As I understood, you said that this interpretation of the exhibition in the museum proposed by Peace is much more ideological than the other one. But following Max Weber thought, every kind of exhibition has this aspect, but the value is different, right? You present. So is it really less objective? Do you think so? I have a question also for you. I mean, I understand what you say, like the proposal to change attitude to collective memory, but if you ask the question why actually people should remember Jews in Poland, they have no interest. And actually after the transition, there was no systematic new policy of collective memory by previous governments, which would change anything. They just were passive, I would say. And now we have government which is more active in this field, because they have very focused on historical policy. So this so-called normal people have no interest in remember someone who is not their group, right? Member of the group. So if you ask the question, why we don't remember, maybe the answer is a mechanism which produces such remembrance, right? We know that this very often comes from the above, from some institutions, a policy who sponsor this, and yet that is the best case of this process. And the other question, there are lots of cities like this in Poland. What is special about Białystok, where there was Jewish majority, they disappeared, and now in different degree people remember them or not.
Okay. If there no more question at the time, let's hear the answer.
Should I answer first?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, strategic remembering. So on the one hand, this very new category of cursed soldiers. It hasn't really been discussed earlier. So that's one of the instances, but also a very selective approach to remembering the Polish-Jewish relations. So focusing on, of course, more positive sides rather than acknowledging the responsibility for anti-Semitism. I mean, it has been done by the sort of intellectual or academic elites, but it is still not really acknowledged in a wider way. I mean, this government was, for instance, thinking of introducing a law that doesn't allow to, how can you say, to smear the Polish nation. So if you criticize the Polish nation or accuse the Polish nation of something, you may be subject to some kind of punishment. So, and when it comes to exaggerating or inventing, of course, there would be instances of it. So, exaggerating, you know, the Polish suffering as opposed to Jewish suffering, for instance, is a very sort of typical example. Inventions, well, we can talk about inventions. Why should Polish people remember the Jewish past? Well, the idea is that if you don't come to terms with the past, with the negative...
The question is not normative.
Mm-hmm.
Because I
Mm-hmm.
think yours is
Yeah.
kind of normative. Mine is not normative, so my question is rather, you know, outside this moral order. It's rather kind of, I don't want to say scientific question, but you know what I mean. What makes them remember? Or what would make them
What would make them remember?
In this sense, yeah? Yeah, you can change the grammar of the sentences.
Yeah, I guess it's about also a feeling that this was a joined past, right? Because if you remember the past only as communities, that, okay, it wasn't our community, so it's not our past, right? So if, for instance, in the public sphere, you have more elements that remind you that it was a past that was lived together, perhaps that would already change the perception to some extent. But they did to some extent as well. I mean, to emphasize, for instance, that, authors of the popular children stories were Jewish, right? Like Tuvim, or to kind of make you realize that this is not a separate past, I would say. I don't know if I have an answer either.
So just a second, maybe the point is also that even in these accounts, in the interviews, the memory that is suppressed is really coming up, and this is also a problem. They do remember, very many of them. They don't want to articulate the memory. Of course, we can talk also about post-memory mechanisms, right? How do you dig this memory, not to transfer it, and so on. But if we look into the interviews from right after the war, during the Wagner trials and so on, there is memory there, and it's just suppressed. And first of all, and then there was pressure also not to speak about it. So.
Yeah, exactly. If you look at Mizy Jedwabnego, there was this reportage, kind of historical investigation, in which the author looks at the testimonies right after the war of the people who lived in Jedwabne or knew about what happened. They are, and then if you compare what they say now, it's also a completely different story. So there is a memory, but it has been completely repressed. So. Yeah, and what is special about Białystok? Well, of course, the fact that it was a fairly large city and a very multicultural city, if you want. But also because it is now considered as, I mean, it has been considered for some time as this less developed part of Poland. So this idea of shaming, perhaps, that was proposed by Professor Czapliński yesterday would be interesting, that somehow these are the margins of Poland, and somehow, you know, the feeling that you have to assert your presence even more is, would be an explanation, perhaps. Yeah, you were, oh, sorry.
As to your comment, of course, I don't.
Question.
Okay. Apparently, there are two different ideologies behind each vision. One ideology, I would say, would be more civil state oriented, but in general, I don't really believe that museums are places for most of all, for objective presentation of the past. I would say that museums are rather spaces for intersubjectivity, which means, in consequence, that the crucial question is what is your attitude as a museum towards the visitors? Yeah? If you treat them as subjects who are capable of interpreting history, or you treat them as pupils for whom the story is told and there is no possibility to reinterpret it. And in those two different visions that shift, this is the biggest, I would say this is the very big difference, and it is ideological in both cases, because one talks about individuals that have the power to influence history, and this is the ideology of neoliberal ideology and so on. Yeah?
Isn't it rather a matter of the way the information is presented, not what kind of information is this?
I think it's both. I think what kind of information are presented and also how they are presented, because the question is whether the visitors have the right to have their own point or they don't. And this is not only the matter of choosing facts and not only the matter of how, I think.
Yes.
So I was struck in your presentation. I just visited Budapest with my students and we went to the Museum of Terror. And I was in Vilnius last year and I went to the Museum of Terror. And now, from what I saw, it seems like the Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk is becoming the Museum of Terror. There is this incredible similarity of the narrative and the images that I saw. The juxtaposition, almost equalizing of communism and Nazis and fascism, the terror, the way this is presented. And it almost seems like they all have the same architect, It's unbelievable. I mean, of course they do because it's the same politicians, but maybe there is also like this, maybe they like Orban makes a recommendation to Kaczynski, take this guy, he's gonna do it, right? So I just wanted to comment on that the narrative, it's not just Polish, this is really very similar to what's happening in these other countries, post-Soviet, of the post-Soviet bloc. I also want to say that I think I agree that there is always an ideology. Like you said, there's always an ideology in the museum. I think, however, it really, and I think that's why it matters so much what ideology it is, because if it's the ideology of larger, enriched citizenship that is being produced in the museum, right? Or performed in the museum, produced also in the museum, because it's also active production of certain versions of citizenship. If that vision of citizenship, if that ideology is an ideology that is more inclusive than just that one nation, then it matters, right? So even though I think that Tusk's idea for the museum was also ideological, it matters what kind of ideology it was. It was an ideology that was trying to include other Europe in the world in what the Second World War was. And now it's the Museum of the Polish War, in which the World War is relatively not significant, right? So I think it really matters because that's the kind of citizenship that is being produced now in this museum. So I don't know. I just want to say I think it really matters. It really matters what kind of ideology is behind it. And I also wanted to say that that I think that in Białystok, because I've been in all of these places with my students and I've seen so many of them, you know. The Białystok is special, I think, because, of course, I have no proof for this, but I think that the strength of the nationalists, of these white power movements and the strength of these movements is especially strong in these territories that were so Jewish, and where the forgetting is so strong, and probably the trauma of the forgetting, because it runs through families. It's not just the official version, that it's not just what the government says. And the government, we know, I mean, except for a very short period of time, after 1990s, you know, 2000s, where there was some kind of an opening to the discussion of the Holocaust, we know that in general after the war, until now, this short little break, the official version was clear. But there is this other memory, right? Is this memory of the community, of your personal community, and I think it's kind of proportionate. To that kind of forgetting, active forgetting, is proportionate to the guilt and trauma of what these places are. And one last comment I want to say, it's not my idea, but because with my colleague we do a lot of Holocaust education with students by taking them to these places, and sometimes, you know, we get students who are for example, from the United States, who really have, you know, and increasingly so, a very skeptical view. I mean, they are almost, they say things that are very deeply anti-Semitic. For example, I had a student this year coming up to me who said, so when we go to Austria from Budapest, he asked me, so are we going to speak about anything Austrian in Austria? And I said, why would you say that? And because in Budapest we only studied the Jews. And we didn't hear what the ethnic Hungarians think. And of course we did, we went to the Museum of Terror, it's all about it. You know, but who is the ethnic Hungarian? But I think that the challenge, you know, of that we are seeing now, there is something happening. It's again, I'm getting back to the idea of why is this new? I think something is happening, something is new, and it's not just coming from our countries here in which we live, and from Central Europe, but these are students from the US who come and they are questioning, you know, this. I don't know what I wanted to say, but this is just comments.
Okay. Right. We have Raoul, we have Deborah, and Maria.
Okay, thank you. It's actually onto what I was asking. So first, thank you both for very powerful and concrete case studies. My first question is for Lucia. Just a clarification of, I think you had sort of a typology where the first one was National Museology mirrors official version of the state and history legitimized through this museum presentation. I wasn't clear how that was different from your third version, where symbolic capital of the past is used as political capital with use of myths. So if you could just clarify those, how you, because to me those sounds like they really interact, but so I want clarification on that. And my second comment to you was really on this notion of democratization of heritage, and it follows up with what I understood some of what Mona was saying. This democratization, especially given those two other types that you put forth, could sound like the preferred version of how to go about doing museology, but it depends, I think, very much on what the ideology is behind the democratization. If it's simply equal voices with no sort of principle of how we weigh the evidence of history, that could also be quite problematic. So that's my first comment to you. And Agnieszka, I know you ran out of time, but I was curious about your own sort of input into reading the text and also maybe positioning the author as well. It was a very powerful case study, but you know, how do you analyze the contribution given who this author is, for example?
Thank you for two very, very interesting presentations. I've got a few just short hopefully, easy to answer questions. First, in your presentation, Lucia, I know you skipped over this because most of the Poles in the room know the story, but I don't, and I didn't quite get what's the current status of the museum, what happened to it, because it was advertising at some point under this slogan, "Come see it before they close it," and I found it interesting that the fact that they were expecting this to happen. So, what is going on now? Because it's changed, right? It's no longer the same kind of museum. It was okay. That would be the first question. The second is more of a comment, like progress. You mentioned is a neoliberal conception. Progress in history is a conception as old as modern history writing. It's the positivist conception. It's been challenged recently, but it's not neoliberal. It goes way back. And also, as a critical comment on that note, this notion of the Europeanization of heritage is also a very progress-oriented conception. It's getting out of the dark ages of nationalist interpretations of history to the light of European measures of heritage, but I don't see it this way. Now, Agnieszka, again, very complete. Now I want to ask about the Smolensk thing. I find it fascinating. How are the events of World War II prefiguring Smolensk? Can you give some examples, please? Agnieszka, memory laws. You mentioned that the Polish government is considering. What was the reaction to the Ukrainian ones? Because I suppose they would react to the Ukrainian ones, considering they involved the murder of Poles. So, what did the Polish government have to say about those, and are they in any way relating their own vision of memory laws to the Ukrainian? Second is also legislation. What's the current status of legislation on Holocaust denial and hate crimes in Poland? And does it exist? Does it exist, but it's not implemented? Are people charged but not found guilty? Are they not charged at all? Stuff like this. And a comment to both of you. Question actually. And it's also a question to Hannah and to my own work, and it links to Viaczeslav's presentation this morning. This singling out of Jews in the Holocaust, in the World War II Holocaust narrative, is problematic for some people because they see the two things as separate. And it was pretty clear in your presentation, Agnieszka, in the interviews, that people would think this is World War II and this is the Holocaust, and the truth is separate things. And we should not mix them. And I think to some extent we reproduce the same issue when we focus on the Holocaust as something distinct from mainstream Polish history or Romanian history or whatever. Would you think, in order to make this relevant, both of the American students who are wondering why are we focusing on the Jews in Budapest, is to integrate the history of the Jews and the history of the Holocaust better with mainstream majority history, not to treat the Jews as these minorities and so on and so on, and be so obsessive about including minority narratives, but linking the minority narratives to majority narratives and seeing the way in which the two
But wasn't this Agnieszka's point that it needs to be integrated?
When? Because the point I got from her presentation was it was never really integrated. After the war, the two narratives just developed separately. You would have Holocaust memory probably outside Poland, and in Poland first the communists forgetting, and then the post-communists forgetting treated the Jewish history. That's what I got, that they treated the Holocaust separate from World War II.
My question to the co-organizers, we're running 20 minutes late. Is it okay?
Yeah.
Can we go on? Fine.
Okay.
Fine. Okay. So you want to
I just wanted to
interject now?
So I think that the problem is that because of the silencing, that when you're teaching, because we don't teach specifically the Holocaust, we teach the identity of Central Europe. The objection is that we talk about the Jews at all. And so, but you are sort of, as a person who's trying to teach this kind of, more diverse type of history, and really, and that's what I forgot to finish with my story, because I forgot, but I was saying, my colleague, in response to what the student said, but it's like, this is, you cannot teach identity of Central Europe and historic identity of Central Europe without talking about the Jewish, about what happened here, about the Holocaust. So, we do that, but you are, in the position of bringing out things that are so deeply silenced, and just by bringing them out, you seem to be like, just focusing on the Holocaust, just by speaking about it. So if you say it, then you are suddenly, somebody who is focusing on the Holocaust too much, just by mentioning it. So that's what I want to say. I think that there is an effort, to bring the two together, but they. Okay.
So Sabina.
What I have to comment, I think, actually follows up from what Anna and Raoul have said, because I think this concept of terror is a very present one nowadays. I think there's a lot of terror, but there is a lot of terror happening all around us. And as far as the American students are concerned, I've just seen the 9/11 World Trade Center Memorial, and that's it's kind of very in the middle of New York, and it's very visible, and there's this kind of it looks like a rectangular pool with water running down from the edges, and there's all this. I perceive it as a very strong symbol of history that's ongoing, and we have to. Gosh, this is terrible, and we have to make people aware that it happened, but on the other hand, we have to learn from it and move on from it and keep it always present, precisely because we need to make sure it doesn't happen again, or well, do what we can for it not to happen. So I guess all this at the same time, there is a lot of mentioning of the Holocaust all over the place nowadays, and the Holocaust studies seem to be much more present than they ever were. And I guess it is related to the fact that we are at the moment witnessing a lot of minority discrimination and a lot of terror. And in relation to that, I was thinking of this drive to spatializing memory. And of course, we've been talking about sense of memory for a very long time again. But then if I connect your two papers, which were wonderful, thank you very much. If you think of on one hand, cities that used to be in one way and have changed. Cities and cemeteries, cities as cemeteries, right? So you visit a city that used to be totally different and from which a certain community, the Jewish one, has been eliminated, erased. As compared to museums that are about institutionalizing memory, in a sense, about preserving memories. They're supposed to kind of conserve stuff and teach people something, but on the other hand, the narrative they tell is not the one that was intended, because sometimes they are built with a certain purpose in mind and they're used in different ways. So is this spatialization of memory a way of teaching the past in order to inform the present? Or is it more about a kind of nostalgia that's keeping, that's preventing progress? Yeah, you just started about against, I think, progress in history. But progress in the sense of, in the ethical sense, I guess. That makes sense.
So perhaps we can have some short answers from you.
Short for these questions.
Because we're gonna go on forever.
I know we could go forever with that, I know. I'll try to be very brief then. To start, I'm sorry for not being clear enough, because I skipped several things, that's why it was not clear enough. The current state of museum, I start with that one because then it gives the situation. Now you still have a chance to visit the museum in the shape which was designed by an ex-director and an ex-team. The director changed, and the exhibition will be probably changed soon. What I was trying to focus on with my research was not actually only the exhibition, but the debate over the museum, because it actually highlights the vision of the past, and it highlights what the vision of the national identity actually is, and so this is basically the current state of museum. It is what is very important is that the museum is national. Yeah, it's ruled, it's financed by the government. So so the government thinks that because it's financed by the government, it should represent the proper Polish viewpoint, and it's interesting to see what the proper Polish viewpoint is in that sense. Yeah. In terms of progress, I skipped it because all the model that I tried to present comes from of course, the Enlightenment idea, and it fits well with some neoliberal issues, with some not. Democracy is one of those things. Dignity, equity, diversity, all of them are those ideas that actually are a kind of ideology, but also are a kind of framework to which we can relate by asking questions about the exhibition. One of the other concepts, which is also a post-Enlightenment one, which is so important here, is the concept that heritage needs to be something practical and is not self-explanatory any longer. So the past is not sacralized, and it's not enough. So the Europe says we need to use heritage. We need to make heritage something practical. For example, we would teach citizenship basing on the past. We would teach geography with the use of old maps, and so on. So I think while heritage is no longer self-explanatory and needs practical usage, this is also one of the phases of post-Enlightenment, influence. Because we don't really have time for that, just to give you the answer about where the prefiguration of Smolensk is, because nobody would believe that it's true, because that's how absurd it sounds. As you know, all mythology gets actualized in public rituals, and this is what happened now on the 1st of September with the anniversary of the First World War. And the celebration was prepared by the scouts and by the city, because the president of Gdańsk didn't want to agree for the Ministry of Defense to take over the whole ceremony. And the scouts were supposed to be reading that list of all the heroes that were murdered there. While the government's idea was that in the list of all the heroes, you would start from the heroes of the Second World War, ending up with the president and with the heroes of the catastrophe. So this is sort of list of our heroes, and because in Poland the cult of ancestors is so strong, it is very important that we actually make a very clear storyline. That we all start with Lech Chekurus and the Battle of Grunwald, whatever, and then it all goes towards it, and the recurrency of the time model is very straight. I think this is it.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. What is the position of the author? So on the one hand, I chose this author because taking into consideration other works that of reportage, since this is the material that I deal with, they focus more on particular events. So for instance, Anna Bikon's on Jedwabne, then there is a reportage on 68 anti-Semitic campaign, which I would like to eventually incorporate. I think this book for a paper like this is a good material because it joins sort of the present instances of racism or anti-Semitism and this Jewish past. In fact, the author admits in an interview that he was motivated by the fact that Białystok has very high, let's say, police ratings on hate crimes. And I think this element of Jewish past kind of came later in his, when he was started to investigate. Also, he's a fairly young person and he's not Jewish. So he came from a position of an outsider to Białystok. Of course, now he's the public enemy. so yeah, very briefly. About Ukrainians, there's definitely a sort of competition in suffering or martyrology, and there are, well, it's a whole different topic maybe that wouldn't be addressed here. Let's keep it for later. Holocaust denial. There is a legislation in which you cannot use Nazi symbols. And of course, there are laws about hate crimes, racist crimes. However, for instance, when it comes to issues discussed in the book about attacks on sexual minorities, that is not present in the Polish law, so they can't complain about being...
Nothing like non-discrimination?
There is general non-discrimination, but there is a non-discrimination for gender, for, national, minorities and so on, denomination, religion, but there is nothing on sexual orientation, so... I think it's not. There is some...
It must be, but if it's defined the way Agnieszka was saying, then it's defined exclusively for Nazi Germany. So then any kind of Polish guilt is absolved.
Well.
We've had the same since 2006 and 2015. And only since 2015 did we introduce a new one, which also includes Romanian countries. Before it was, like you say, swastikas and Nazi symbols,
Yeah.
but it did not cover Romanian fascist symbols.
Well,
Partially not.
and yeah, integrating minority sort of memories. So yeah, what I tried to say is that even the attempts of integrating these stories are not very well done in the end, because if you sort of exoticize the minorities and if you consider them as like sort of the interesting tourist attraction to see a mosque or a synagogue, I mean, this is not really going to achieve the goal. So I think that's it. If I missed any comments,
Okay,
I'm sorry.
so thank you very much. Wonderful session.
We will have a 5 minutes break.
God.
Bring coffees and teas here.
Okay.
Well done.
Thank you.
She promised you know that. Need to double check it.
There is some
celebrate the peace, right?
Yeah. To say this would be the place where people would be commemorated. But also the other way around, that museums are going dispersed throughout the cities. To mark that their authority is also
Over the city.
over the city.
Right, that's very interesting.
I think the spatial aspect is absolutely crucial.
I think so because it interferes with today's life, right? So it does something, it brings history to the present, so this present dimension of history is the most important, in fact, because, you know, being nostalgic about the future and but, you know, you need to do something about it, right? So,
Yeah.
especially at this time of terror, that's what it is.
Thank you. Very